Mike's off on vacation. He's going on a wilderness safari pretty much. I think he's like rafting on the Colorado River for like the next 7 days or something. So he's not going to have access to his computer or his phone, which I'm sure he's probably going to go into some detox where he's twitching and stuff because he doesn't have his phone right by his side. But I know he deserves like a well-earned break. He's a workaholic. So today you've got me, Vivian Hudson, leading this webinar. And okay, so I'm a little hard to hear apparently. So is anybody else having problems with me? If I talk a little louder, is that better? Is that better, Nancy? Yes, a little. Okay. Well, I'll be handing over to Daniel in just a couple of minutes anyway. But thanks if you've just joined us. As I said, my name's Vivian Hudson. You might recognize me from the podcast. You might have heard my name mentioned before. But usually if we talk anything about equipment, then usually my name comes up. So Mike asked me to lead tonight's webinar and just basically bring up some of the equipment. So I had the fortune of talking to Daniel, and he's agreed to share his wisdom on the DND. So I'm only going to spend like a minute here on the TM Flow device. But as you know, like the TM Flow is a piece of equipment that we have had for a number of years, and it's a significant tool in our diabetic diagnostic and treatment protocol. And the reason that we use that is because it gives a complete assessment of the patient's autonomic nervous system, their vascular system, and gives the patient also an overall cardiometabolic risk assessment. So it's quite a comprehensive tool. It takes just around 10 minutes for a patient assessment, and physicians get a lot of value out of the equipment because it helps them to differentiate the patient's symptoms. It helps them with early detection of chronic metabolic diseases such as type 2 diabetes, and that's one of the key reasons that we have it as part of the diabetes diagnostic and treatment protocol, is because it's going to give doctors and patients a heads up if they're heading towards type 2 diabetes. And by doing so, it's going to help identify some of those early complications that can occur through uncontrolled blood sugar levels. And it's also helping with treatment management of those programs as well. So Johnny is still saying he can't hear me. So what I'm going to do is I am going to hand over to Daniel Medrano. Daniel is the person that introduced us to the Diabetic Neuropathy Device well, I feel like it's many years ago, but I guess it's been a couple of years now. And he's the expert when it comes to all things loss of peripheral sensation. And he's got a lot of pearls of wisdom that you can get out of today's session to help you better understand how this equipment works, the value to the practice, and also how to use the device. So I'm just handing over to Daniel now, and he'll be sharing his screen, and hopefully his audio is a little bit clearer than mine. So
great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
well, thank you,
everybody hearing Daniel? Is Daniel better?
Do I sound okay to anybody, or do I need to be? I mean, I don't know if there's something else I could do.
Yeah, you sound fine to me.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Vivian, again for the introduction. And you're right. It's been, I think, almost 2 years now that we're working together. So, if I may, I'm going to go ahead and just give a quick description about what the device is. I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding as to what it is, what it's supposed to do, and then we could get down to any of the questions that you have once I'm done with that presentation, if that's okay. So, as I start, you'll notice that I'm going to our website, and this is a diabetic-neuropathy-device website. And that's important because it's going to have a lot of the clinical data, anything else that most questions ask or most providers, reps, distributors ask about the device. And it's important only because I think it's a plethora of information. And so starting out, the diabetic neuropathy device. Okay, there's some feedback with someone. Okay, great. I think I've stopped this. Thank you. The diabetic neuropathy device is a modern solution. If you're familiar with just the historical value of what diabetic tools have been used, we are really looking at one of the few solutions similar to the TM flow, but we do what we think is a lot more. You are able to acknowledge that it has been recognized as a medical design device. This is probably one of the biggest awards, New Hampshire, but the technology itself is patented. The device is also patented, so a few patents on the device that just came on really 2014, so it's still a new concept for a lot of providers. We like dealing with a lot of the distributors who focus on family practice or primary care, family practice, internal medicine, OBGYN, and of course specialists, podiatry, cardiologists, things of that nature. But the diabetic neuropathy device does two things really well that most cannot do, and that is that it adds objectivity, because most tests that are done are still either one small fiber, or not both large fiber and small fiber, and only on the bottom of the feet. That's fair. That's probably just the way the market is. If they're using monofilaments, they try to, and I'll clarify, if you're not familiar with what monofilaments are, tuning forks. So it's always easier for me to assume you know nothing. And that's the first thing that it's going to be able to do. It's going to be able to go throughout the peripheral extremities of the body. And secondly, it is able to standardize testing across all medical institutions. That means is we're really looking at whether it's podiatry or family practice. If a patient's identified in family practice, then they can refer it out to podiatry. And then a podiatrist can refer it out to a vascular or a cardiologist. And they start looking for different things for different reasons. Cardiology, more upper extremity, podiatry, of course, lower extremity. But that being said, it is an option that all of the providers will have the same results, right? Meaning that it doesn't matter whether it's, I'm based out of Albuquerque, if it happens in New Hampshire, New York, Florida, California. If it's a normal reading, they're going to be normal. If it goes to an abnormal reading, that's already the first indication that there is something going on with the patient. So without reading everything on the website, it talks about why it's justified, it's evidence-based. And the device does identify both large fiber with vibrations and small fiber with temperatures. We are uniquely qualified in the sense that American Diabetes Association has actually addressed, under the diabetic right here, diabetic neuropathy, a position statement by the American Diabetes Association, because they're looking to utilize both a temperature and a vibration for both small fiber and large fiber. So other pieces of technology don't offer the temperature, and the temperature is really probably the biggest point in this entire device that makes it unique and makes it its greatest value. Because as patients start to lose the sensation, it's also known as loss of protective sensation, temperatures are the things that they could still feel. You've heard stories, if not, of patients who can step on a nail and they don't realize that they've either cut their foot, something along those lines, and then it can get infected. However, if it were a cold nail or a hot nail, they would feel the temperature of that nail in their foot. So that's really unique, because that's what the device does, is it allows certain temperatures that patients with a small fiber can still sense. It is modern technology, and here's where we have a comparison between the tools. The very first tool that most clinics, or majority of clinics, use is a tuning fork, and probably 99% of all clinics will have monofilaments. Tuning forks were invented in 1711, and they were designed for music, as you could tell. And monofilament was invented in 1938. They use them for different things, as we still know it as fishing string. And they are able to serve multiple purposes. The DND was FDA cleared in 2014. And again, each of these tools has a purpose. Monofilament is supposed to be able to measure both large and small fiber. However, it is not objective, meaning if Vivian ran a test and she said a patient did not have neuropathy, and I ran a test on the same patient with the same tool, I could believe the patient has neuropathy. So that in itself makes it subjective versus it being objective, right? And modern simply because of when these other tools were created and that they're still in use. And for me, that's probably one of the biggest pieces that is alarming, that we still use outdated technology in healthcare. If you go to a medical provider, you want them to be able to tell you that there is an issue. You don't want them to guess, right? Because it's not really a diagnosis. It ends up being a prognosis, right? Prognosis meaning that it's very likely. But it's not a true diagnosis with an objective tool. And ours delivers a true diagnosis and can validate that, can be repeated, and again shown to have either normal or abnormal results. So the importance of that is it's an early diagnosis. So there are times American Diabetes Association asked and requests that pre-diabetics also be measured. There are certain insurance companies that, there you go, thanks. But they could have the opportunity, they ask, to go ahead and test patients with pre-diabetes as well if their A1Cs are close to a level that makes them diabetic. And so that is one way that some insurance companies look to heading other issues down the road. Again, this is early diagnosis. There are studies from 2009 Annals of Family Medicine that talk about the accuracy of monofilaments, because that's really the one that's everywhere. And in testing for a diagnosis of peripheral neuropathy, and they made the recommendation that they do not recommend the sole use of monofilament testing for peripheral neuropathy. And I think for the simplicity of that, it's subjective. Now, if you were to add another tool like the DND, it absolutely will give you objective data rather than subjective. The point that I made earlier is that a lot of medical providers, and I'm talking more family practice, because there's a large group versus there are more of them than even podiatrists, is when they're looking at a patient's foot or feet, they're only measuring the bottom of the feet. That's really it. And that's a majority. There's some data to show that they don't even go to the top of the foot like they're supposed to. Most of the time they're supposed to go between the first and second digit and other points. And I think if anybody who's familiar with the type of foot testing is they limit the quantity of sites that they will test for. And some of those issues is that they don't know when a monofilament is supposed to be thrown away. And to make it more complicated, some monofilament manufacturers say to throw it away after a certain amount of tests, say that it has to be used on no more than 5 or 10 patients, and then put away and not to be used because it loses its fiber mechanics. But with our device, we can check both the bottom of the feet, the top of the feet, the ankles. We can technically go anywhere if we need to. Shoulders, the forearms, hands, fingers. That wasn't me, I promise. That being said, we're looking at all peripheral sites. And so that makes it that much more important because we're supposed to, a patient with diabetes is usually diagnosed with polyneuropathy, right? Polyneuropathy is this. This is ideal. Sometimes it will go up to the shoulder, right below the shoulder, and sometimes up to the thighs. So no other tools could, up to this point, can deliver multi-objective data to acknowledge that. And how does that do that? So it is providing better testing, but it provides numerical values. So again, sticking to the fact that this is how most providers will look at a foot. Some can choose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sites on the foot, and this is what most may do. What we do is, this is an actual assessment of a foot. It wasn't these feet, but these are the values that a patient had that can reflect what really is going on with the foot. It's practically mapped with these numerical values. And the numerical values represent 1 as normal, and you'll see that in a green color. 2 is mild. So there's already a form of neuropathy on that foot. And usually what American Diabetes Association wants is if there are 2 sites or more, then that should lead to an early diagnosis for early intervention. Is that the provider, that family practitioner, podiatrist? Again, not for us to say. That's really up to the provider. You know, do they have a program that they want to talk about? Nutrition, exercise, other types of means of therapy, something similar to PT, laser therapy. I mean, it goes on. There are different things that they could do. But again, going to the numerical values, 1 green, 2 is already mild, 3 is moderate, 4 is severe, and 5 is extreme. So this predictive data lets you know and lets the patient know that on this site, this is the first place that's likely to develop a diabetic foot ulcer. This may be second, and or they may both happen at the same time. What this allows the provider to do, since most MDs are the ones who have to sign off on diabetic footwear because a podiatrist cannot, it will tell them that they can look at this and start making the appropriate modifications on the orthotics or on the shoes. It's great that, let's say, both feet, if we were testing with any other technology, may or may not. It's almost like a 50-50 with other pieces of technology. Yes, they have neuropathy, or no, they don't. Like flipping a coin. And nobody wants to have their health care based off of a 50-50 or a coin flip, practically. Or just saying that we tested the feet and this is the measurement. It's not telling you where, right? And the important aspect of the technology is exactly where. If you go in for an x-ray, because maybe, or an MRI, you have some pain on your shoulder or your arm, you don't want them to just come back to you and tell you, yeah, you have a break. Or no, you don't really have a break. You want to see exactly where the break is, because that's going to lead to the appropriate intervention. Do you need surgery? You know, is it going to be worse? Things of that nature. That's what this simple tool does, is it allows you to find the sites so that those sites can be treated. And again, as we go back to where the technology can identify it, you know, let's say some of these patients are in a hospital. Well, if you're familiar with the number of bed wounds, this may be able to help that as well, because they're usually on the bony sites that are on the bed, because they don't move a lot. But that being said, is this can identify some of the biggest risk factors in all of this. Foot care programs throughout, if anybody has them, they're usually just monofilaments. Again, the monofilaments come back to the fact that they're subjective. It's a guess. It's as best a prognosis again. Diabetic care, that's a large number. That's the largest number of people with diabetes who are going to have the likelihood of diabetic foot ulcers. And if you're familiar with how quickly a diabetic foot ulcer can occur, that happens easily anywhere within 3 months. There's some types of medications, some that have gone onto black box warnings for indications that affect the liver and can create lower extremity issues. SGLT2 meds is an example of Invokana, that within 3 months a patient lost vascularization, and some have had their foot amputated and legs amputated. That's a black box warning from the FDA, that wherever that goes, and what the reasons for that are, is it's relevant to check a patient who has, again, abnormal readings. And most of those readings usually occur on the toes right, because they're the furthest from the heart. It starts on the top, goes down, and then eventually inhibits the entire foot. So some of those tests we can identify and catch early. But again, as indicated, we also could test the hands, right? We can test parts of the entire hand. So we're not limited in regards to the amount of real estate that is relevant. And that's why we say not just feet, but it's important for limb salvages. And since the last piece of data that came from the CDC is that, and this is a number, if you remember anything else about the DND, remember the number 85, because up to 85% of lower extremity amputations among persons with diabetes can be prevented with improved foot care programs. So up to 85, right? That's pretty ridiculous, meaning if you're already a person living with diabetes and you start with some form of neuropathy, if you get an ulcer, your likelihood of getting an amputation will be as high as 85%. But it's preventable, right? This is the whole point in what this device is here for. It's not about only the providers using a new tool. It's the fact that you're able to identify something that has not been identified since before 1938. No providers have really had this much data, and it doesn't take long for them to be able to get the data. I mean, we're talking about a comprehensive foot exam bilateral in less than 5 minutes. The very first time they use it, maybe 5 minutes, right? As they get quicker, they can do it in 2 or 3 minutes. But as preventive medicine, right, as we were talking about the graded levels, once somebody has a foot ulcer, and it's real quick, what they're not showing is that they're already they have some form of neuropathy, right? It starts, you get to see the bones, it opens up. At this point, this doesn't ever really get to this level for amputations, but it happens very quickly. So levels of wound care, the important aspect for all providers and hospitals, and this is really important, is, and this comes from providers who are using the technology, by the time a patient fails a monofilament test, he or she has profoundly severe neuropathy, and it may be too late to intervene. And this is Dr. Suzuki. He's the medical director of the Tower Wound Care Center at Cedars-Sinai Medical Towers in Los Angeles. And he's been using this for almost 5 years now. He had it before he even wrote the article. And failure to diagnose is the very first thing that providers will be sued for. And what does this boil down to? Why would a hospital or anybody else, is this liability, right? And there was a case in 1990 where a patient, without going long into that actual case, is the courts ruled that if a hospital or provider, they are responsible for keeping up with technology, not the other way around. So what does that mean? It makes any sales rep, any distributor's job a lot easier. But could you imagine if an attorney started looking for all the patients who had amputations when technology has been around since 2014, has been available to identify and diagnose, what that would do to a hospital, what that would do to a practice. And the importance is it's very simple, it's very affordable, it's not super high-tech. And that opportunity is something that every person who calls on a PCP or practically a specialist who deals with lower extremities should talk about this, but you also have to do it very candid, maybe not candidly, but in a way that needs to remind them. And when somebody clicks on the link, they'll see what the case does and why they're responsible for their practice or for their hospital. And again, I'll probably just touch on this because primary care providers sometimes only see patients once a year. And the inventor of this is an internal medicine doctor. And his scenario was that sometimes he would see patients coming back without a foot or without a leg. And he was really upset simply because he didn't have that contact with them. And because other providers either A, didn't use the right tools or didn't know how to use those tools, or everybody has a different opinion using subjective tools, that it was never solidly, objectively confirmed for the patient's neuropathy, which led to some form of amputation. And amputation carries a mortality. Most people don't know that if you have an amputation, you have approximately less than 5 years to live, and that comes from the CDC as well. So all the data, any statements that I make will be available, and they're usually available on what I have over here on clinical references. But just coming back down, the legal aspects, but I think the aspect is to also share the notice of the technology. And we kind of, in that first page on this, to acknowledge the problem. Tools being used aren't sufficient. Either our tool needs to come in and assist and validate, just like they do in regular labs, right? And if a primary care provider is using any lab service, they're going to get the UA, and they could do a test there, but then they send it off to a lab for confirmations. Well, our device is that confirmation, but this doesn't always have to be something that's for confirmations only. They have the options to come in and use our tool early. So the fact that there is a problem, we put that 99% of all U.S. medical institutions today depend on subjective tools alone to diagnose peripheral neuropathy. That's a fact. And if you're new to this, ask the providers, what do they do? Or do they check patient speed? If they do, what tools do they use, right? And we think we're the first step, because as Vivian indicated, another piece of technology before I started, we think this technology is the first step. Because number one, it's approximately a quarter the price of a larger piece of technology. And sometimes providers, really every provider, us as consumers, we look at price first. So when our piece of technology brings in the opportunity for as large a commission as a bigger piece, but is also a quarter of the price, you have to acknowledge that this does not just the bottom of the feet. It's only one of three pieces of technology, granted, compared to the larger one, but this one's going to be much more functional for a practice, which leads them to potentially the bigger piece of equipment. Because if you can earn their trust with something like this, then they have no problem buying a bigger piece of equipment for you, right? And that's what we want to do. A lot of the reps want to continue to generate revenue, and this tool allows you to be able to get that. So showing the problem, and that's a quote that I use from CDC, is that an estimated 44 to 85% of lower extremity amputations among persons with diabetes can be prevented with improved care programs. So the solution, or a solution, is adding the DND to diagnose peripheral neuropathy can bring objective and standardization across all medical institutions and organizations throughout the world. So again, it doesn't matter whether it's Albuquerque, New York, California, and India, you name it. It's going to do the same thing. So going into probably the testing, just to kind of give you a quick synopsis of how the testing looks. You see what it looks like with the testing, with the color by numbers. When we're talking about large fiber, right, these are considered large fiber, A alpha, A beta. Smaller nerve fibers, A delta. When they talk about C fibers, there is no myelin sheath, right? It's almost like a corn dog, right, that's been cut. And here it's just like the axons, the nerve fibers themselves, they're really hard. And we kind of list what happens with, and this comes from data that's been out, A alpha, what they can feel and why. But when it comes down to C, they can only measure temperatures on average, where they can no longer get a sensation, possibly with the monofilaments or tuning forks. And that's why it becomes important to utilize a stimuli like temperature. So here's a sheet of what it looks like. We often use the left hand, because similar to an ABI, if you use the left hand to obtain blood pressure, this is closest to the left ventricle of the heart. You're going to get the strongest data, the most accurate. And then you can compare that to what's happening on the feet, right? Because if a patient as we show here, if this is normal, here's mild. If a patient doesn't feel the normal vibration or temperatures here, then you shouldn't expect normal vibrations to be acknowledged down here, because they already have a cardiovascular issue, right? And whether that's medication or anything else, or if it's potentially just going to be on the lower extremities, that will become relevant. And so this is always listed on the types of tests. So here I only show the large fiber. Of course, temperatures also encompass small fiber. So other than that, that really is the basis. Here we list, our medical director lists the types of medications that cause neuropathy. A lot of patients that are under chemo, and you'll see them. I mean, everything is listed here. So if you know a specialist or some specific that is looking at these, then that's what it boils down to. So I think at this point I'll kind of open it up to see if you have any questions, and let me know. Vivian, can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
You haven't been talking to yourself for the last
okay.
30 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to, I muted a couple of people, so I'm just going to unmute people. So if they do want to ask any questions, they can. But now's a good opportunity. Daniel's super familiar with this device, had a lot of success using it in different practice types. So take advantage now of his expertise. And otherwise, if you think of some questions afterwards, then definitely you can reach out to me or to Daniel directly, and we'll address those questions. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, I hear you fine. Yes.
All right. Anybody?
So are you still able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, hold on. Okay.
So any questions?
I have a question. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
I hear you fine, yes.
Hey, Daniel. Thank you. Hey, this is Johnny calling from Columbus, Georgia. I get all the science behind it and how important it is, but what's your best advice for if you have 10 minutes with a doc to get him interested?
Yeah, I think a one-liner is, what type of provider are you talking about? Anyone? I mean, because if it's the podiatrist, okay. Yeah, family practice is kind of easy. It's like, what do you guys test for a neuropathy, right? Is it subjective or objective? And I mean, that's probably one of the easiest things. They're usually going to say a monofilament. If they don't even know how to describe a monofilament, they'll say the little string or something like that. And then just tell them, that is subjective, but would you consider using an objective piece of technology? And I think that's probably the best way. Depends on who you're talking to, right? If it's the provider themselves, yes. That's the start. Because in the same scenario I gave, like an X-ray or an MRI, you really want to know what's going on, because that's good medicine. So nobody ever really wants to just provide some type of prognosis. They want to be as accurate as they can. And realistically, it gets more profitable for a practitioner if they start to treat that. Right? Sometimes they feel that they don't know. It's like, okay, I found it. Now what? Well, now you can go into the different types of therapies. And I think that's where every ancillary is really great about offering ancillaries that answer the now what scenario. Because they can go into food, exercise. I mean, there's so many things that they could do.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and then go ahead.
The other important thing about this device is how easy it is to for early detection of loss of peripheral sensation. So one of the big things is often by the time a patient is diagnosed with diabetes, they've already lost some of that sensation. So if doctors proactively use this device instead of relying on their monofilaments once the patients become diabetic, they're going to be quite surprised at how many patients do have some loss of sensation. Because neuropathy, it's not something that you wake up one morning and go, oh gosh, I can't feel my feet anymore. It's such a slow and progressive onset that patients, they're not aware of how much sensation they've lost in their feet. And doctors, frankly, doctors probably aren't really either. And if they start to use this kind of device much more proactively, they're going to be very surprised at how many more patients they'll pick up with this particular problem.
Yeah. Are you still able to see my screen, Vivian, or is it not available?
Yeah. Did
okay.
You show
well,
anything else? Or?
Yeah. I was gonna try to have our certified biller coder, because realistically, aside from just the benefits of the product and the device, it comes down to, okay, what is it? Can it be built? And our coder had some great pieces of advice. And again, the benefits are that we always ensure, and this is what we want everybody who's involved, who's going to talk about it, don't try to be something you're not. You can't be a doctor, right? Nobody's licensed as a doctor unless you're a doctor. A coder is also licensed as a coder. And like doctors, medical providers have their own scope of what they can do and what they can say, right? You and I'm not a clinician. I could not prescribe meds. Medical providers could. Billers and coders, if they're certified billers and coders, and we're not talking about just a billing company, but if a coder can acknowledge and confirm that there is a code that meets the criteria of what is being used, then that's applicable. And that is in the scope of the coder, certified professional coders, and that can take precedence in their scope of practice, right, in coding and billing for providers. So the codes that have come up, we've used some of the G codes in the past, but when we had the opportunity and we reached out to different coders, certified professional coders, and some are certified professional coders and billers, it came back, which is really interesting because I know this code really well, a 95923. And I wanted to just address that really quickly, because if you look at the codes and if you're familiar, what I did is we were able to describe in greater specificity of what each of those qualify for the code. And the first is a QSART. And if you recognize it, if you could see the screen, it is a sweat test.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Daniel, all I'm seeing is the Diabetic Neuropathy Device, like your website.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if you've pulled up a different document.
Oh, okay.
So you just probably need to go back to that square.
Yeah,
to
let me see.
Right, and just select.
I see. Okay, I think. Let me see. Oh, okay, I see what I did. Apply changes. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. So here we are with the coding and giving a description of how this code reads from CMS. And this is important because this is internal use, right? This is confidential for everybody who's here on the call to understand. And we show what each of those, how it's described, the description, testing of autonomic nervous system function, pseudomotor, including one or more of the following: quantitative pseudomotor axon reflex test, also known as the QSART, elastic sweat imprint, thermoregulatory sweat test, and changes in sympathetic skin response. So if you'll notice, there are 4 that are listed, of one or more that it is valid for 95923. So the different coders came up with the fact that all you need is one, and it pretty much says that, including one or more. There's a QSART, and so we described the QSART here. Again, it's a sweat test. The elastic sweat imprint, again, another sweat test, and thermoregulatory sweat test. Again, 3 sweat tests. The 4th is not a sweat test. And there aren't, that I've looked, there aren't any, or any of the sympathetic skin response tools. This is it. So what happens is our device is a sympathetic skin response. And when we're looking back at what this really means, here's the catch. Why you always want to have a coder. and biller, because our device meets the code description for CPT 95923 as a sympathetic skin response. It simply does. Our neuropathy testing product is generally but not specifically approved for reimbursement under any third-party payer codes, which means that the coders can make that determination with the provider and fill that in for them. If they agree, then that's in their purview. If they do not, then that's something they're not going to do. So in the end, part of that discussion that we have is we share this discussion with providers, because most of those guys, if we're talking about family practice, they don't generate a whole lot of revenue. They really don't. They're kind of limited to what they do. But when we're talking to them about ancillary services, the data comes back, and there are pieces of technology, as we indicated, monofilament and tuning forks. They don't have CPT codes either. But similarly, monofilaments and tuning forks do not officially have any billing codes, but meet code descriptions that have reimbursements affiliated with their use in Medicare and commercial insurances. So the G codes that exist that we used before were specifically for monofilaments and tuning forks, but they were not officially granted a code. And same thing with our device. We did not seek out a billing code, but our tool with technology meets that description for the CPT code. So we want you to be aware. We want to be upfront and just acknowledge that this is the technology that addresses what has not been addressed since at least 1939. That's probably the most fair assessment, because neuropathy was described even before then. So if there are any other questions, anything else I need to state, Vivian, or let me know.
Anybody else have any other questions? Okay. Going.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, I'm not seeing anybody else.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Vivian, for the opportunity to share our product, our device.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Daniel. This has just been it's such a easy to use and practical device for doctors, and it's certainly worthwhile bringing up in the conversation when you're talking to practices where they're interested in doing the whole diabetes protocol or just this device on its own. It's going to be something that potentially can save limbs, and we've got a full suite of products that can help those patients. So that also up to 85% of amputations can be prevented. This is just one of the steps that can help do that. Okay, I want to say thank you so much, Daniel, for getting on tonight. And if you haven't already got the Diabetic Neuropathy device in your toolkit, then make sure you go to the Every Ancillary website and add that to your bag. And Daniel's available for any other questions at any other time as well. Thanks a lot, Daniel. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Damien. Bye-bye.
Bye.